Hi, folks. We're talking about Chapter 6 European Americans and Whiteness. And ultimately, when we're talking about European Americans and whiteness, we're really talking about whiteness as a social construction. We're talking about whiteness as a modern idea, as exemplary of race and what race ultimately encompasses, and races as ultimately modern ideas. And so we'll begin with some social history and some demographics. And generally, when we're talking about European Americans and whiteness, we're also talking about white ethnics. And so we're referring to whites who have ethnic ties to their nation or homeland of origin. So they are those who voluntarily migrated to North America and the United States. And so we're talking about groups like Polish Americans, Italian Americans, American Jews, as well as Irish Americans. And so, in looking at these groups, among others, that would also fall under the umbrella of European Americans and whiteness, we're also always looking inherently at push and pull factors. And so, again, we're looking at the things that brought folks to the United States that were attractive with respect to what ultimately North America was like truly before it became the United States, but also during that process of becoming a separate nation from our British underpinnings. But we're also looking at those things, the factors that pushed white ethnics and European Americans and European folks away from Europe. And so we're looking at political and economic challenges largely that pushed a lot of folks out, and again, the lure of opportunity in the United States, or what was sort of the fledgling beginnings of the U.S. as a colonial outpost of England as the North American continent. So we're talking about white immigration beginning in earnest with respect to North America in 1607 with the establishment of the English settlement at Jamestown, Virginia. The earliest white settlers with critical mass were the English, and the English settlers, they formed the basic institutions of U.S. government, what would become U.S. government, that were modeled after norms and customs of their native England. So they initialized the basic template, the basic format for whiteness in the New World as and by default. Also, many of these early settlers entered the Virginia colony as indentured servants for a set period of no more than 7 or so years, and so that period of servitude was eventually suspended, particularly with the advent of forced chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. The English colonists, they held their dominant position even as immigrants arrived from Scotland, Germany, and Ireland in much greater numbers. And so again, by being the firsts in a significant critical mass, they were able to again establish and reinforce those norms we just discussed. The latter groups, again from Scotland, Germany, Ireland, among other areas, they formed the second and third waves of European immigration to North America. We're looking really at the period from the early 1800s to the mid 1900s. The new white ethnic arrivals were often viewed with hostility, suspicion, and they were not really regarded as white. They weren't thought of as members of the same race as those from the English, so-called white Anglo-Saxon Protestant sort of background. Currently today, whites comprise roughly 76% of the U.S. population, with those of German ancestry comprising the largest white ethnic group. In terms of intergroup relations with respect to assimilation, so that has often been viewed or seen assimilation as the most typical intergroup consequence for whites and of white Americans. Yet, those again, European immigrants from a variety of non English backgrounds, they struggled for dominance despite that strongly held position by those again of English ancestry. White ethnic groups such as the Jews, the Irish, the Italians, and the Germans, as well as Scandinavians, they formed ethnic enclaves, if you will, in major cities as a response to significant discrimination and rejection by those of the dominant culture. Now, in terms of whiteness, we're talking really about a uniquely American concept that really emerged during the slave trade itself. that ultimately predates modern anthropological and biological concepts and norms. And so the notion of whiteness and its dominance, that is consistent with what we've ultimately assumed as what was norm or normal or normalcy in our society and in visibility. And it does contribute to notions of colorblind racism, which softly otherizes those of color and prioritizes white comfort when we collectively experience and see and experience racial dissonance happening in our society. So, the idea being that, well, we've got to uphold and protect and preserve whiteness, and in so doing, we've got to remove the experience of white discomfort. Um, the dominance of whiteness elevates whites to a higher social class, thus eliminating class solidarity across racial lines. And so white folks don't always, often do not have some sense of class connectivity with respect to being middle class, working class, or being wealthy with those members of groups of color. With whiteness, we're also talking about white privilege, these unearned benefits and advantages that whites experience from simply being members of the dominant group. And so this goes back to the pioneering work of Peggy McIntosh. And so we have a good list of these in our text discussion as well as our notes. And so one of the main things that Peggy McIntosh talked about in that very, very seminal work is that, well, for whites can, if they wish, they can be and arrange, if you will, to be in the company of white folks most of the time. If they need to move to another city or town, they can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing a house or housing in an area that they can afford and in an area that they would want to live. They could be pretty sure also that neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant. They can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that they will not be followed or harassed. And again, these are automatic experiences that whites have that people of color do not. And so that's what we mean by privilege, that it just automatically comes with ultimately the social packaging of whiteness. And strongly related to that, we're talking also about the concept of white supremacy. And really, with this, we're looking at the systematic and systemic ways that the racial order benefits those deemed white and operates to oppress those of color. With that, we're also looking at the notions and the discussion of the concept of white fragility. Simply the notion that racial discomfort makes white folks fragile and is consistent with this colorblind racism. And so, again, we looked at that before. If there's this effort, this notion to make racism colorblind, well, why are we doing that? And ultimately, there's a book coined of the same title, White Fragility, the notion that, again, just talking about race, just acknowledging racial difference makes whites uncomfortable, and often that there's a collective effort, regardless of the race or ethnicity of the participants in social settings, to kind of rush in and ultimately protect whites from discomfort. Right? With respect to intersectionality, while all whites benefit from white privilege and white supremacy, they don't all benefit equally, particularly if you're a white person who's poor, or if you're white and you're from the working class, you're not going to have the same experience of whiteness or the same white benefit, if you will, that a wealthy white person would have, for instance. Whites that are greater benefiting, those who are cisgender, white males, upper middle class and wealthy whites, whites from metropolitan and larger cities and areas, white Christians, and those who are able bodied. Those are exemplary of the whites that, with respect to intersections, tend to have greater amounts and greater privileges that they can leverage. Those whites who tend to benefit less would be members of the LGBTQ community, white women, poor and working class whites, whites from rural areas, non-Christians, and whites who are persons with disabilities. The greatest social pressures on whites are experienced by those with less privilege, again, which is consistent with often these pejorative, these negative terms directed towards them, for instance, right? Institutions, we can't leave them out. Again, we're looking at organizations that perform the basic functions and ultimately reinforce the basic norms of our society. So these institutions, again, are inherently involved in the distribution, the direct distribution of societal rewards and resources. And so we know that the distribution of societal rewards and resources, it's uneven. It's largely held in the hands of whites. So we're looking at those in terms of the richest U.S. citizens, when we're looking at Congress, when we're looking at levels and layers of government, federal, state, as well as local, who our governors are of various and sundry states and territories, our military leadership, our media executives, our teachers, our professors, and our sports team owners are all overwhelmingly white.